presentation about ways to value or determine the loss resulting in timber theft or trespass, where theft is criminal, more intentional, and trespass is unintentional, but still the trees were removed. And we're just going to talk about the case where trees are removed. There are other types of theft, such as truckloads being missed on purpose, or maybe loading trucks a certain way. There's different types of theft, but nonetheless, we're just going to talk about where trees are being removed. So basically then, right, we need some estimate of the value of the timber lost or damaged, and therefore we're going to need some estimate of the volume or tons lost or damaged, because we buy and sell on tons. Then we need stumpage value. So we have the amount that's removed, lost, damaged. Then we have the value of that. And of course, the stumpage values can depend on the size of the trees. Is the volume pulpwood, or is the volume or tons saw logs or chip and saw, or is it poles, the quality of the trees? And then the species of the trees. One, for the stumpage values, also say if we're doing growth and yield models or volume equations or ton equations, weight equations, we need to know the species. Now, they could depend a little bit on proximity to the mills, your ability to harvest. I'm not exactly sure. What I'm getting at is, let's say like on a pulpwood thinning, you were not able to thin, right, your plantation, let's say, or your forest, but yet the theft or trespass still occurred. Can that person say, well, you're never going to be able to harvest anyway, so therefore I don't owe you anything? I don't think legally that's going to work. I think you're going to get the fair market value. You're going to get the reasonable stumpage values. But really, this is nothing more than a typical timber cruise, just that the trees are no longer there. So you're going to have to kind of come off and work off of the stumps or some other means to get at that estimate. And to me, statistical efficiency and accuracy are still going to come into play, your bias, just like a normal timber cruise. So here is Mississippi Code 97-1759 dealing with theft, and you can see the value of the timber, fair market value. Here is trespass 95-510, and such a tree equal to double the fair market value, which now the question becomes, how do you determine the fair market value? So a very common way is through a stump cruise. To begin with, we commonly estimate volume or tons using mathematical equations. These equations are developed based on other trees somewhere else, often like in a research or an academia setting. And we're often going to predict them as a function of diameter and height. So diameter, breast height, 4.5 feet above the ground, and then often trigonometric principles, mathematical principles, we determine the height. And you can think of it, right? Diameter, d squared, that would be your area, and then h would be your third dimension, and that's your volume. Volume's a three-dimensional variable, right? So that makes sense that we're going to predict it as d, diameter and height, particularly when you square diameter. And then there's other variables sometimes thrown in there, but right, usually height's going to be total height, at least initially. Then we have these volume ratio equations. Everything's working off of equations, and really the big kicker is diameter and height, and usually diameter, breast height. Then they're going to be species-specific equations, say for loblolly, often, or loblolly pine plantations, natural, we have specific equations. And then sometimes you may have composite generic equations. The species really aren't that important or valuable enough to worry about it, such as maybe like black tupelo and ironwood. You may lump them together in a composite. Nonetheless, though, we're going to try to take advantage of the correlation between stump diameter and breast height, the taper of trees. And so you can see when this tree is being severed, usually the stump height may even be just down at the ground. This is from an actual timber cruise on LSU Ag Center land. They got right down to the ground on the fellow buncher. This is just for example, but you can imagine there's a relationship there between the diameter of that stump and the diameter of breast height, 4.5 feet. Now remember, all these equations are usually going to run off of diameter at breast height, because really the diameters along the tree are really built to support the weight above it. So there's strong correlation between the diameters at any point along the stem to one another. So a very common thing then is to come over here to adjacent trees. Now, if it's a total clear cut, you got some trees removed in a theft or trespass, you really can't use adjacent trees. But often it may just be, particularly in trespass, it's just 1 or 2 acres that inadvertently got cut. The logger wasn't paying attention. And so therefore you can use the same trees, same genetics, same population, right? And you're going to measure stump diameter here, dBH, and then total tree height. You're then going to make these mathematical equations to predict dBH as a function of stump diameter and then predict height as a function of dBH. You're then going to come back over here and measure stump diameter where you have no trees, and then predict DBH based on these adjacent trees, and then predict height as a function of the DBH from these adjacent trees. That's a common way. Another way to do it is there's mathematical equations developed somewhere else, and then you're going to apply those mathematical equations here straight off a stump diameter. Either way is going to be a stump cruise. Often I see a lot of this adjacent, particularly like I said with timber trespass, where it's not the whole acre. Now remember, everything's about predicting DBH and height. And once we get that, then we can use our volume equations and weight equations. These are actual stump diameters from here and DBH. And you can see there's a very strong correlation between stump diameter and DBH. Therefore, we can use that relationship to our advantage for the trees that were removed. Then we need our stumpage values. And there's Timber Mart South and then our own Mississippi State University timber price report. So these are very valuable. So we've now determined the amount of volume or weight loss, and now we have the value per unit, and then we can get the total value lost. So another way to do it is through growth and yield models, particularly like in a clear cut, right? I have no adjacent trees, and I have no trees there, so they're all gone. That's why you always probably want to keep good records of your forest at all times. But based on the planting density, based on the site quality, I can then, thinnings or not, I can manipulate it. I can get an estimate in the virtual modeling world into the real world, and then divvy that up based on the acres lost, once again using the same stumpage values using that growth and yield model. Another thing is, let's say I had an inventory 5 years ago. I can use these growth and yield models to grow the forest forward without really having to have an actual timber cruise. So these growth and yield models are these mathematical equations that represent biological processes developed usually in some type of research or academia setting. Potato is a common one for pine plantations. Forest vegetation simulator from the Forest Service is another one for mixed species stands and naturally generated forest. Another thing that growth and yield models allows us to address is revenue for gone. Not just the fair market value of the standing timber today, but the revenue that could be generated based on the condition of the standing forest today. My understanding is much of the restitution is designed to give you back the state of the forest that you had before the timber theft or trespass. Well, imagine a 50-year-old bottom hardwood forest. It's going to be very hard to get that state of that forest back with restitution. Another one that's kind of a little more easy to understand is, let's say you have a 12-year-old loblolly pine plantation. Well, that's 12 years towards, traditionally at least, a 15-year-old first thinning. That's 12 years towards a 22-year-old second chip and saw thinning. That's 12 years towards, say, a 30-year-old final clear cut, and maybe more traditionally a 35-year-old final clear cut. Well, you're now set back to year zero. You now have to start over. You now have to run the risk and the uncertainty of that reforestation. What if we have another drought year like we had during the summer of 2023, and that ruins your reforestation activities? You already were past that stage. So to me, you should be compensated to some extent for that risk or uncertainty from that investment. You've also lost that. Beyond that, you also have had 12 years of property taxes. And that to me is why you see a lot of times like 2x or 3x fair market values. Now, think of a 12-year-old loblolly pine plantation, particularly today. That stumpage probably doesn't really have any value. So how do you really get compensated for that? So a lot of times we can project the forest out and then calculate the revenues that you would get throughout that rotation and then discount that back. Beyond that, think about like a timber trespass case. You have 1 or 2 acres of 100 acres. How hard is it going to be to get a planting crew to come out and plant 1 or 2 acres? It may create problems, say, with some of the reforestation cost shares, perhaps, but with the Mississippi Reforestation Tax Credit, you now are going to have to apply that maximum $75,000 lifetime amount, $75,000 over a lifetime, to those 2 or 1 acres, again, to the same acres. So all I'm saying is in my opinion, you should also receive some kind of restitution for that. And if you're in an actual timber theft or trespass case, you should talk with your attorney, lawyer, or your forester who is representing you and see if you can't get that some restitution or compensation for these other factors as well. Beyond that, think about if you had a 12-year-old loblolly pine plantation. Now you're replanting those 1 or 2 acres. Now you have a 2/8 forest. are you ever really going to be able to thin or clear cut that 1 or 2 acres? So basically, you may just lose that 1 or 2 acres for that rotation. So there's a lot of things to consider, and that's where these growth and yield models can also be helpful. And then other things, right? Remotely sensed data. I think this could become more important as this data becomes more available, the frequency of it, right? Let's say if I can start getting satellite imagery or LiDAR, but particularly satellite imagery daily, what I need is the forest estimate before the theft or trespass and then right after it. So, right, if I have this daily, I can almost monitor whether my forest had timber theft if I have access to that imagery. As the imagery gets less expensive and our analytical ability becomes better, I think this is going to become much better tool. Particularly, I always want to keep good records. So if I can pair this remote sense data with good records, I can have a better way of interpreting that remotely sensed data. I can also pair, through this double sampling, I can also pair FIA on the ground data, or let's say this part here was removed. I can do a very low intensity cruise here, relate that on the ground cruise back to the remote sensing signatures, and then come back over here and get probably a much better estimate based on the double sampling. As I said, as the cost continues to go down, the frequency becomes more dependable, the coverage becomes better. I think the remote sensing is really going to be a helpful tool. And you can also imagine this could be very useful for casualty losses, non-casualty losses. You have the satellite imagery just before the hurricane and then after the hurricane, if we have sufficient methodology to measure those variables. Thank you.